Um, so thank you all for being here. I'm Azar Bestavros. I know many of you, but maybe some of you don't know me. I'm a professor of computer science. I'm also the director of the Hariri Institute for Computing. And we are here to celebrate Chris's appointment, selection as a junior faculty fellow at the Hariri Institute. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Hariri Institute and about this particular program. So we have been in existence for about 6 years, a little bit over 6 years. And for the first 3 years, we're sort of under the radar because we're just trying to figure out what we really are. But the last 3 years have been just amazing in terms of finding connections across the university. The Institute's mission is really to connect computing and data sciences with all the disciplines in the university. We believe, and I think all of you agree, that there is no science that's not a data science. Let me just put it this way. There is no science that's not a data science, because everything now using data is very important, and part of that has to do with algorithms, machine learning, data mining, all these things that we worry about for computing and data sciences. So this is the mission of the Institute, to act as this connector between what BU is very strong in when it comes to computer science and engineering, but also where BU is very strong in the disciplinary aspects. And certainly, we found a lot of traction, so there's a lot of interest in that. The very first program I launched at the Institute, the very first program, like within 2 months. I think Mark was on the steering committee at the time, and it was a junior faculty fellows program. The idea is that if you believe what Anwar just said, every department is now hiring people who are data scientists. They're doing scholarship in their own fields, but they're really also data scientists. And in order to create that critical mass that can find each other and talk to one another, we decided to create the junior faculty fellow with the new faculty coming on board at BU, connect them to one another, get them into their second home, which is data sciences and the Hariri Institute. And this has been the best program we have done. So this is a competitive program where the nominations are submitted, and every year we select a cohort. As a matter of fact, the deadline for application for the next crop is coming up in a few weeks, April 11th. So, we really hope that we get the best. You know, the nominees don't know that they're being nominated, and they shouldn't know. And then when I announce it, they're so happy. So, with that, I'd really like to, and I want to say a few words about the Hariri Institute. Please follow us. Please come to our talks. We have a lot to offer that is not sort of your usual computer science type things. We're really about empowering you and connecting you with others. You know, I don't want to take too much time to talk about what we do, but the least you can do is join our mailing list and maybe join us as an affiliate, and then you'll get a lot from us. So with that, Tony, I'd like to have you introduce.
Okay. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce Christophe. Christophe came to BU just a few years ago. He finished did his PhD at the University of Michigan with Arun Agrawal, one of the world's best scholars on sustainable development, on land change science, and then went on to do a PhD with Eric Lambin at Stanford, equally distinguished. And so he comes to us with this wonderful pedigree of doing research at the interface between human decision making and how the actual surface of the Earth changes, potentially as a consequence, potentially for other reasons. The topic that he's going to talk about is really, I think, one of the really most important topics in conservation, in understanding land use change, and that is what works. There are a variety of sort of policy experimentations that one can do, and what works. How do you evaluate success? What does that actually look like on the ground? And how can you tell if, in fact, you are making a difference? For some of us, this will be the first time we've heard Christophe talk at length about his research since his job talk, so we're anxious to hear everything that's happened. But for everyone, I think we can look forward to a really stimulating and interesting discussion. Christophe.
Thanks so much, Azar and Tony, for the introductions. Good afternoon. I think this is a great time first to say thank you. I don't want to say that at the end of the presentation. I want to say that at the very beginning. I'm very grateful for the support of the Hariri Institute, not only as a junior faculty fellow, but also for a grant that we just received that will take this work to the next level. So thank you for that. I'm very thankful to the college and the department for allowing me to have a 5-6 year period to work on something that takes a lot of time to build. So that is a unique opportunity. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mark, for proposing me for this to this program. I hope I'm not embarrassing you now in front of. And then I'm very grateful as well for the incredible remote sensing group groups that are here at this department, without whom this work would be impossible, as much as to the incredible IT staff that we have, without whom this work would be impossible as well. So thanks to all of you. All of this would be impossible without you. And thanks to all the others for coming. I'm very glad to see this turnout. I want to start with a question. With a question for you. Can we switch off one of the lights? Is that too dark? Okay, wonderful. If you had access to data of all the properties in the United States, where they are, who owns them, when did they sell, how they're zoned, whether they're protected, demographics around that area, terrain, wetlands, whether they're on a lake or on a river, how accessible they are, whether the land cover on them changed over the last 30 years. What questions would you ask? And I'm asking that question because, well, I built a thing, and I built it for a purpose that has to do with my research agenda, but it is multifunctional. It can be used by lots of other people that are interested in working with this data for reasons, for questions that they want to pursue. Right? It is not exclusive. I will justify my research from my perspective and somewhere where I come from. But this question, I think, is a larger one. If you had access to this kind of information, what would you do with it? And two qualifiers. Most of those parcels are of conservation interest, which means they have a minimum size, larger than a hectare. And most of them are not urban. So if it's about where to buy your next Boston property, that's not going to be the answer. It is also about questions that are of academic public policy interest, because many of the data sets in here are licensed for academic use and not for private use. Okay, so I want to leave you here with that question, and keep that question in your mind as we proceed through the talk. All right, so where does my question framing come from? As initially mentioned, my questions have to do with effectiveness of conservation, and my talk is structured will be given in 4 components. First, I will justify my framing. Where does it come from? Why private land conservation? Why now? And what are the interesting questions? I will spend a little time explaining what it took to build the system that I'm talking about, which I call Places, for the nerds in the room, and also just to add some realism and perhaps to explain why my publication record over the last 2.5 years is not as I would like it to be. And then I will show you already first indications, the first analysis that we have done with this data on 2 very different topics. One is about impact of protection in Massachusetts. The other one is work that is on the way on automated easement appraisals in Colorado. So these are just the first little fruits that come from this database. And as I mentioned, the Hariri Institute has just given us a grant to scale this up to a much larger area. All right. So back to the framing. What difference do conservation interventions make? This is a question that many people ask. If most people that study in environmental science, many students that come into those programs want to make a difference. They want to know what works. And they're not the only ones. There are donors around the world that spend billions of dollars in the aggregate on supporting conservation programs anywhere on the planet. And this question about, does this money actually make a difference? Do we make a difference is a big one. And an important one, and one that has different answers for different contexts and different policy instruments. And so I specialize in in answering that kind of questions. Most of my past work, if you ever come across my website or my current profile, has to do with work on the deforestation frontiers of the world. So we've looked at impacts of protected areas and indigenous land in the Amazon, zoning in the Argentinian Chaco, both of which are deforestation frontiers that are deforested very, very rapidly right now, and you see them from space pretty well. And other work was we did in the Congo, in Colombia, etc. Most of it is on very large scales, and the interventions that happen are big interventions, large interventions where we can see on the satellite imagery how those interventions made a difference. So, but those large interventions, those big interventions, are actually relatively rare. You know, you might see, okay, Brazil reducing deforestation by 70% from between 2004 and 2008 and following, which was a unique event which everyone working on the Amazon is aware of. Or anyone working on the American West is probably aware of the Northwest Forest Plan, which made major regulatory changes for the future of forests in the West. But there's a lot of conservation that happens at very, very small scales, at the parcel level. There are parcel level transactions, protecting this parcel, small parcels, another hectare, another 5, another 10, etc. And those are small, but there are many of them. And it's a big financial investment in the United States and in some other countries. So in the United States alone, direct public funding for land acquisitions for the purpose of conserving land was in the order of $2.5 billion per year. Tax incentives for donated land were in the order about $1 billion per year. Another $1 billion per year more or less comes through philanthropy. So these are all rough numbers, but it's a large activity. Here's a map of how that funding is, how the public funding is distributed, which I made a while ago, at the county level. So we see a concentration of spending in Florida, for example, here in New England, and then in New York and the neighboring states, and also on the West Coast and in Colorado. And it involves many, many organizations. There are thousands of land trusts. There are hundreds of local governments. There are several state governments and the federal government, all of which are engaged in that activity and are shaping the landscape of conservation in the states. The most rapidly expanding conservation instruments in the United States is the conservation easement. It is a transfer of a partial right to a property. It is a permanent restriction that is parcel specific, that can have any kinds of regulations in it, and that usually reduces the ability of the landowner to subdivide their land, build additional things on it, use it for agriculture or timber, depending on what the easement is. Every easement is different. And there are more than 150,000 in the states. And this map shows the distribution of area, which is somewhat similar to the map of funding you saw, but not exactly. For example, you have massive easements in New England, which are forestry easements, so you can still do forestry but cannot subdivide them. And so this is the main driver of conservation in the States today, of like parcel level conservation. And it's not only in the States. Other countries do that too. For example, Colombia had a law since 1993 that obliges all local and state governments to invest 1% of their resources in land acquisitions. And we have a project in which we try to bring that data together and do similar analysis. Chile is another country where we're running analyses because of a quite large number of private conservation initiatives. There is no global survey, but it is happening in many countries, especially those with very strong private property rights. Australia has a lot. We don't do work there because Australia have a lot of scientists that are doing already work on that. And so what kind of questions are interesting to ask? Well, I usually frame my questions in 3 general categories. One is, where does it happen? How much does it cost? And what difference does it make? The combination of which should tell us what overall, like, are these good investments? Are these, should we expand them, etc. But But then when you break those questions down, they can mean a lot of different things. A lot of interesting sub-questions. You know, what are the private lands that attract conservation? Are there certain lands that just are more likely to be protected? Does it have to do with whether they're species or whether there are beautiful views, or whether people just want to make sure that their neighboring property doesn't get developed? You can ask how many disadvantaged communities have access to parks. You know, like where are they located? Does the public get a fair deal? The land conservation movement has had several cases in which, like high-profile cases, in which it was said that some people made a lot of money from those interactions that shouldn't. Does parcel-level conservation increase fragmentation? If you don't protect an entire area, but just one by one, do you increase the probability that land cover changes around those parcels? And then the larger questions: how will the landscape of the future look like? What outcomes can we reach with the given budget, which is a question, for example, of interest for someone who wants to invest carbon credits or in a natural resources damage program. How much carbon emissions were avoided? So these are all sub-questions of these overall larger questions, for all of which we need data. The good thing is, in the United States, there is a lot of data. For every state, for every county in every state, you can, the parcel data is, usually exists. Somewhere there are good records. The records are usually accurate. And in most of those places, you can know where the parcels are. You can even, there's a digital map for it. Actually, still not in every county, but in most of them. When you have that data, you can intersect it with all kind of other spatial data and get the information that you want to answer the kind of questions. You can look at this parcel in 1992 at the satellite image or the aerial photography, and then see that something happened to it from one time to the other. If you also know when it was sold, you might even know who did that. But to work with all of this data, we're talking about millions and millions and tens of millions of parcels here. You need a system that is distributed on servers that do all the computations, decentralized, because not one computer can crunch all that data and help you get tenure, because it would probably take 5 years to crunch all of that. And so I noticed that the best investment I could do at the beginning of my tenure track here was investing in a system that could produce those data sets quickly, that would use all those public data sets and turn them into parcel-level rich information that could then be used to answer all these other questions. I call it the Private Land Conservation Evidence System. I would say that's a working title because it has a nice acronym, if you accept that the A is a big one. It currently has 20 million parcels in it, in the counties that are marked here in dark green. The counties marked in light green, for those we don't have the locations of the parcels, but we do have the tax assessor information, for which we usually have point locations, but not the spatial boundaries. And so here's what this data includes. Well, everything starts with a spatial parcel boundary. And then from there, those parcel boundaries, where do they come from? Well, originally they come from the county registries, from the registrar's office is that the right term? Anyway, from the counties, but because every county does their own thing, actually in many places every town does their own thing, they need to be aggregated. And so they're commercial aggregators. The good ones are very expensive. The so-so ones are not that expensive. And many states make partial data public. Massachusetts does. So Massachusetts was an easy one where you can create a public data set without infringing on the strings that are attached to some of those data. Well, and then you can continue. You can natural features. There are a lot of good data sets from the US, from USGS, from the US Fish and Wildlife Service on where the lakes are, where the rivers are, where the wetlands are. Land cover change, you observe that through satellite data. And again, I'm very happy to be in a department that has really good remote sensing teams, some of which whose products are used here in an analysis I will show. For those who are not aware of that, there are data sets here where at 30-meter resolution, we can observe land cover change at essentially any temporal resolution for the last 30 or more years. And that fine temporal and spatial resolution is crucial to make some of this work. Infrastructure, ownership, sales, structure, valuation, all that information is with the tax assessors of the different towns and counties around the country, which is also aggregated by expensive real estate companies. But thankfully, Zillow decided to make their records accessible to academics. And so that data set was really, really interesting to start pulling into the system. We want to look at conservation. So of course you need information of where conservation happens. Where did transactions happen? Which parcel was bought? Was it an easement or not? Who did it? A public, a local, a state organization, an NGO, or someone else? Again, these are data sets that you need to pull in. In addition, we want to get even richer details, so we started coding some of the documents that provide information on what exactly the restrictions are in an easement and how the value of that easement is appraised. And then, of course, demographic information gives us a lot of stuff that we could not easily observe from space, such as how rich is the population that lives in this area, and how dense it is. So all of that information has to be brought together. And I just want to have 2 or 3 more slides on 2 particular technical issues I ran into, and that actually made this process a lot slower than I thought. Because if you see this and you have done some spatial work and some GIS, you might think that should be easy. You just do some spatial intersections and then you do some joins. Question?
Sorry. Can you just define precisely what you mean by parcel?
Thank you. With parcel, I essentially mean what the tax assessor calls a parcel, which is in most cases, which is a polygon that is owned by someone at the level at which ownership is defined. A property, depending on how you use the word property, can consist of several parcels. Several parcels can be sold together, but at the end, it's like the smallest unit at which ownership is defined. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify. Yeah. All right, so 2 surprises for me was how hard it is to do spatial intersections, and how hard it was to link the property boundary data to the tax assessor data. And so I just want to spend a few slides on those. So the first, I don't want to say constraint because it's not really a constraint. I wanted to do that anyway, but we're working on the shared computing cluster, which runs Linux. And so it does not run Windows, which means that the classical tool that almost everyone who has ever worked with GIS knows does not work. Good invitation to look into what is working on Linux. The first package which I looked at was a Python package called GeoPandas, which is essentially I would say at this point, the standard for vector manipulation or vector data set manipulation in Python. It did have topology errors for the spatial intersections. Then I moved on to QGIS2, made it run after a lot of help actually from one of the people in the department, Chris. It also actually produced errors that were hidden. There was a bug in that program that was not made very public. Finally, I made everything work with Grass, which is another tool, which also created its own area of issues. QGIS3 came out just 2 weeks ago. We finally got it working. Well, I finally got it working on the servers, but there's still a few issues. But the polygon intersections work. And so 1 week ago, I noticed that GeoPandas, the new version, actually does not have topology problems anymore. And so, great. I built the database new yesterday, 2 days ago, on a new folder with on a new space where we have now 10 terabytes instead of 200 gigabytes, and it worked smoothly. And so finally, all that process is done. But it took a lot of time. This took far too much of my time. All right, the second issue is the joy of matchmaking. When you want to connect parcel numbers that are provided by MassGIS, for example, the parcel data of Massachusetts, and that provided by Zillow, which contains the information on buildings and on structures and on value and on sales, etc. Well, they don't use the same syntax. More so, every town in Massachusetts has their own syntax. So what do you have to do? You have to actually develop a way to extract information from this syntax, and then convert it and put them together. So in the end, there was the need for something that would be able to connect this, which means we actually have a lot of handwritten regular expressions and a lot of conversion patterns that were needed to connect this data from Massachusetts. There's actually one student in the audience who is taking this work further for New Hampshire and Connecticut. Thank you. All right. So we have been able to connect about 50, 60% of the counties that we have so far. The data sets are great for Massachusetts and for Colorado, and now it's like about expanding that. So when I was wondering, when I tried to answer the question, why is no one actually already doing such a data set, because that should exist, here are some of the answers, potentially. All right, but now we have this data. So what can we do with that? As I mentioned, I want to have just show two applications. One which is done in the publication process. The other one is in the process and is the main emphasis of my work this year. So Massachusetts gave us a really good opportunity to test the question of impact first. What difference did protection make? In Massachusetts, because there are many parcels that were protected, because we already had a fine resolution, fine temporal scale land cover change data set from Massachusetts developed here. And so and the data set was public, so we even knew that we can publish the Massachusetts parcel data set. So there are about 220,000 parcels larger than a hectare, larger than 1 hectare. Sorry for the European measure. I know everyone here thinks in acres. No, not everyone here, but everyone in this country that is not a scientist, probably. Anyway, we have about 220,000 parcels, of which 6,600 were protected in that time period. And so in the time period 85 to 2006, the land cover change data set went until 2012. So to have like some post-protection time frame, this is where we had to keep the cutoff. And then the question is, what difference did it make? Did it actually reduce conservation? Did it reduce development? Did it reduce forest loss? Which is not necessarily an obvious, there's not necessarily an obvious answer to that, because across the world, a lot of conservation happens where it makes the least of a difference. It's a global, pervasive, very well documented phenomenon that a lot of conservation happens where there is very little threat. So the question is that the case in Massachusetts or not? The other interesting question that I mentioned earlier is that of unintended fragmentation. If you protect one parcel, it has been documented that the value of the properties next to that protected parcel rise, because people are like to be next to protected parcels. Now, if that also means that there more development happens next to that protected parcels than otherwise, you would increase fragmentation by protecting a specific parcel. You would protect this parcel, but you would lose something elsewhere. Did that happen in Massachusetts? All right, so a lot of the land cover change that you see in Massachusetts is this low density development. And if you look at where the patterns of where forest loss and where development happens across the state, and where protection happens, you see some interesting patterns. So back to the allocation question. Blue here is the probability that a parcel gets protected as a function of covariates. And then green and yellow are the probability that it gets developed, that it loses forest or that it gets developed as a function of the same covariate. For the blue and for the green and the yellow line, it's only unprotected parcels. So we don't get a bias from the protected parcels in there. So you see, well, one thing you see, those patterns are highly nonlinear. I mean, okay, if you were to control for other covariates, they might become more linear, but you definitely have very nonlinear one-dimensional patterns. And what you also see, for instance, here, if you see you see that the shape of the protection function of the empirical probability of protection is almost a mirror image of that of a development in forest loss. So those areas that are most likely to get developed or lose forest are also the least likely to get protected in this case. But overall, there was one covariate that was particularly strongly associated with the likelihood of protection, and that was parcel size. Large parcels, much more likely to get protected, which makes sense, of course. You want to reduce transaction costs. You want to protect the big chunks. Most conservation organizations want that. But it also means that if you don't know how big the parcels are, if you do an analysis without parcels, you miss that pattern. You miss the fact that people will be going after the big parcels. All right, so that's in terms of just where those parcels are. Now, what difference did they make? Now, to understand how would you quantify how much difference a intervention makes? This is the kind of question that the field of rigorous impact evaluation tries to get at. And there are a range of methods to try to do causal inference with observational data, with data that doesn't come from an experiment. And there's one that I use a lot because it's one that's quite nice to use and it's also very easy to communicate. And that method is called matching. Matching takes units that were treated, in this case parcels that were protected, and then looks in the pool of unprotected parcels for those that are for one or more that were as similar to the one that was protected as possible in terms of all the variables that you put into this analysis. And so it is a very data-hungry method. It wants you to have essentially data on theoretically everything that has to do with the likelihood of protection and the likelihood of forest loss. In practice, you try to get the best data that you can, you run the analysis, and then you try to infer whether or not there are some variables that you missed and what impact that would have. Anyway, we did have a lot of variables that came from the system. And so we ran this analysis for Massachusetts, measuring, so essentially what you get, we have 6,600 protected parcels. And then you have a very large number of unprotected parcels, and you end up with the pool of the unprotected parcels that is as similar to the pool of protected parcels as possible. And then you follow them through time and see how well they're doing in terms of land cover change, right? So the outcome measured is the average annual percentage of forest loss or development. And we used the time of protection plus 3, or the year of protection plus 3, until the end of the time period for which we had data. Now you wonder, where does that plus 3 come from? It came from the observation that there are certain parcels that lose forest at the same time that they are protected. Anyone can guess what this is? Golf courses. Yeah, these are golf course easements. So an easement is put on a property that prohibits, let's say, residential development, and then it's developed into a golf course. And you see the time of protection, which is blue here, really coincides with the complete loss of, in this case, forest cover. Right? So you have, and this is not only for, you don't only see that for golf course easements, you also see that for subdivisions, for easements that are created because a subdivision was created. And so to get that effect out, we added a few years and okay, we measured after that. We did a lot of other controls. But again, that kind of detail you don't get if you don't have annual data and if you don't have it at the right resolution. So this is really a good example of how much fun it is to work with this data. All right, so the big question, the one question was, did protection reduce land cover change? The way how this graph tries to answer that question is that for each of those types of land cover change, we have one bar that indicates the expected rate of annual land cover change with protection. And then on the other side, what would have happened if it was not protected? So that is essentially what you have observed on the control group, controlling for additional bias with a linear regression. Right? And so the answers to this question is yes. Protection reduced land cover change in Massachusetts. And when I was presenting that at the conference of the Massachusetts Land Trust, there was a big smile. Good, okay, we got there. Pressure is the main determinant of impact. Whether or not a parcel has a big impact is a lot less determined by how much deforestation or development you have on the parcel, on the protected parcel, all of which are usually protected and you don't see a lot of change. You see a little bit. But the impact is much more determined by what would have happened on that parcel would it not have been protected, right? On this hypothetical value, which we infer from the control group. So not using the control group gives us completely biased results. Right? We would not see this if we didn't do this control. We could also look at different types of organizations, state, local, NGO, different types of instruments, and overall we find impacts for the vast majority of them, although not for all combinations. Okay, so what about the second question? What about the question whether conservation increased forest cover loss around the protected parcels? For that, we repeated the analysis, and we just selected parcels that were around the protected parcels, or that were close enough, so with different definitions of close, and matched those to comparable parcels. So essentially, the treatment was this parcel is close to a parcel that was protected, and so we reran. We did the same analysis, same covariates. To see whether that happened. And the answer was no. Protection did not increase land cover change in Massachusetts over the last 30 years on neighboring parcels. On immediately, this is for immediately adjacent parcels, those within 200 meters. We ran the analysis for several buffers until essentially you cannot do this analysis anymore because everything just becomes one big hodgepodge. But we could never observe an increase. So these are like some effects that you see here. Like if anything, it's a decrease in land cover change. So we could not observe anywhere in Massachusetts an increase in land cover change that seems to have been caused by the fact that a neighboring parcel was protected. To my knowledge, this is the first time that this has been done at the level of the state, of a state. And with this rigorous method, with this like long-term analysis. Because one thing that this also allowed us to do, the annual data set of deforestation, was for every parcel to start measuring deforestation, the land cover change from the moment of protection. Right? So every parcel was actually matched at the time of protection to another parcel, and the next 100 are matched to others in this year, et cetera. So all that kind of analysis allows us to be very rigorous, to be very confident in those results. All right, so yeah, we really don't see that effect that was feared so much. And now with the new funding, we will scale this up to everywhere where we have parcels. Once we get the national land cover change data set ready, or at least for parts of the country. Wonderful. All right, so this is one example of what you can do with this kind of data. The other, I want to get quickly into another topic, which is the focus of my work this year, which is about cost estimation. So for anyone involved with systematic conservation planning or trying to understand where to invest for carbon credits or where to most effectively reduce species loss or where to create parks, understanding how much it will cost to create a certain level of protection anywhere in the landscape is really crucial. And it's also very difficult. There are actually very few analyses that are able to do that at the fine resolution and at the large scale at which, let's say, you might want to do this analysis if you consider a national investment in protecting forests. So quantifying cost at the parcel level is really important. And the protection of parcels with conservation easement is a particularly interesting subcase of quantifying the cost of protection, because when easements are created, they're almost always appraised. Almost always when someone creates an easement on a property, an appraiser will be hired to quantify how much is that easement worth. Now, an easement is worth the difference between the market value, the free market, the fair market value of the property with the easement, and the fair market value of the property without the easement. So if you think about the value of a property, what it actually is the value of the rights to that property. And so if you reduce the amount of rights that someone has, the value should always go down, right? The value of those rights. The ecological value might go up, but we're talking about the value of the rights, of the private rights to the land. And so those appraisals need to happen either, let's say, because the Massachusetts Department of Parks and Recreation wants to create a new park and wants to justify the public spending and wants to make sure that the deal that they made with the landowner is fair. Or it might happen because someone donates an easement to a land trust and then classifies that as a charitable donation and can then deduce it from their tax return, from their income tax, which is for many a major incentive to donate an easement to protect their property, or to give up rights to their property in perpetuity. You can only get that tax deduction if the easement is perpetual, and the vast majority of easements is perpetual. Perpetual means forever. Forever is a very long time. All right, so how does the appraiser do that? Most appraisers, the vast majority of appraisals that I've seen and the vast majority of techniques that I've seen follow the comparable sales method. So I mentioned an appraiser has to try to get a sense of what the property is worth without the easement. And how do they do that? They will go to the sales data of other sales in that county, or sometimes outside of that county, and say, okay, what other properties have sold? How much did they sell for? How comparable are they? And they come up with usually a set of 6 to maximum 15 properties. And then say, okay, and then they start adjusting the value of those properties. They say this one has a less good road access, and this one is next to a lake, and this one it has a better view, etc. So they start adjusting, having certain variables that they use to reduce or increase the value of that property relative to the one they try to evaluate. And then they have to come to a point estimate. They have to say not, oh, it's more or less like this uncertainty distribution, but no, it's this value. And then they do the same thing for the property without with the restriction. Right? So they look for properties that have sold, that have easements on them, and that have sold in that general comparable geography, and do the same thing. Those properties have all different values, and they have to kind of make a qualitative expert opinion argument about how their relative worth is, and have to come to a point estimate. This is exactly what the value is. This is my professional opinion as a certified appraiser. And the difference between those is the value of the conservation easement. Is that clear? Cool. So that sounds simple at first, until you realize that there is actually a considerable cost to this process. An appraiser can usually cost about $2,000, might be $3,000. In some places, I've heard in Massachusetts, there are some places where it's $15,000. It really depends on what that costs. But it's not cheap. It's certainly not something that you can scale up easily to a whole landscape when you want to understand, when you want to do prioritization exercises. The other problem is that because we're talking about a large uncertainty distribution here, there is a lot of leeway in where the appraiser finally determines what the value is. So that point value that the appraiser has to find, he cannot get around this problem and say there's an uncertainty distribution. He has to find this point value, but what that value is can be quite subjective, and so this is to some extent unavoidable, right? You just don't have enough might not have enough comparable sales, but there is a big problem in here. The appraiser may be biased. you could assume if the public hires an appraiser, like if a public if a state agency hires an appraiser, they want to make sure it's a good appraiser that the appraiser is not biased. However, if you donate an easement as a landowner, you hire the appraiser. If you have the choice between appraisers, you know one of them has the reputation of really giving like high appraisals, and the other one does not have that reputation. What do you think whom you're going to go to? Given that tax returns are really secret in the United States, we still don't have the tax return of Donald Trump, for example. So just to give you an idea of how hard it is to get that information, right? So it's private information, a private transaction, private appraiser. Those private appraisals have led to major upheavals in the land trust community. There's an article which is called the $1 billion loophole, just came out last year. Last year, the IRS made a certain type of easement deals a listed transaction, which means they experience particularly high scrutiny by the IRS. So what investors have done, for instance, is to buy a property for, let's say, $5 million, find an appraiser that appraises that property at $30 million, put an easement on that property, say, well, that reduces the value down to 5 million or 4 million, and then get that 20 million in tax breaks. Right? And this hasn't happened once, this has happened frequently. And it's a big issue that the land trust community still tries to find out how to deal with it. So what if we had an algorithm that would use all the data that we have about those parcels, about thousands of comparable sales in a certain geography, and gave us an estimate of the value of a conservation easement? Right? So in those analyses, we have about 6 to 15 observations. This is something I pulled up from the system yesterday. In Massachusetts, we have about 100,000 parcels larger than 1 hectare for which there is last sale information. In Colorado, we have about 126,000. Try to scale that up to the United States. So we have a very large sample to work with. Yes, every state is different. Yes, every state has different regulations, but you probably will be able to find, through matching or through whatever algorithm you use, an estimate that at least is not biased by the appraiser wanting to increase the value of the easement. Question?
Are the names of the appraisers known?
The names, well, the names of the appraisers are known. Well, they're known to the IRS. If you are someone who donates an easement and you hire an appraiser, that appraisal report is part of the becomes part of the tax return. It's not a public document. However, so what we are working with are appraisals that are for easements created by through public funding, and as soon as public funding is involved, the appraisal becomes public information. So me and at this point I think 12, 13 undergraduate students over the course of the last 2 years have coded a lot of appraisals and easements, and those are exclusively state funded easements. So you can say, well, if we get close to what the appraisers actually do, or we can even show how well they are doing it compared to the reference, and the reference is predicting the prices of encumbered properties, the sales prices of encumbered properties, then we can at least, we just go with the assumption that those public appraisers are not strongly biased, and then we can develop an algorithm, could hand that to the IRS or to a regulator. There are lots of different institutions that would be interested in having an unbiased appraisal, and a cheap appraisal, and then they could probably filter out relatively quickly whether those which are within the suitable range, within a range that seems appropriate, and those that are just blatant inflated appraisals. So this is the main focus of my work this year, which includes writing grants to do this really well. But I've already started to play with some of this. I presented this slide at the BU Data Science Day. So for some properties, we already have all the information we need, which means not only do we have the information from places, but we also know that this property has been appraised, it has been protected, and it has resold. So the first one that I pulled out from that sample is this one here, which is about 1,200 acres in Colorado, on a river, surrounded by public land, lots of species. It was appraised for $9 million without an easement. And then the appraiser said, if it's protected, the value will be about 3.6 million. Which means the difference is 5.5 million, which was paid by the Great Outdoors Colorado program, which is Colorado's lottery-funded state-level land acquisition program for conservation purposes, and a main partner in all of this work. So it's from them from whom I got all the appraisals and the easements. So they paid that, and then 2 years later, the owner turned around and sold the property for 6.5. Well, that's of course only one observation. But it shows that those values can be massively off. I did run at this stage a random forest on the data that I had, or on like data that I was certain was high quality because appraisers had used it. 250 estimates, and the estimate that we ended up with was a lot closer to the one that this property actually sold for than the one that it was appraised for. So how well can we quantify the value of easements? We don't know yet. The assumption is it is possible. It is probably it is likely that we will at least have less bias, or that an algorithm can be designed in a way that it is less biased than those of privately hired appraisers. And so if we get there, if we can estimate the cost of conservation for any parcel in a given landscape, or a relatively good estimate of that, that helps a lot of different people. It helps the tax authorities, it helps the Colorado state regulators who have to approve tax credits if they for tax credits for donation purposes. Colorado, the state of Colorado actually had almost stopped their program for an entire year because of controversies surrounding appraisals. It can help academics interested in systematic conservation planning to finally get the fine-grained cost data that they need to make predictions about if we want to protect this species, here's where and here's how much it will cost if we want to create new parks, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where much of this is going. And if you're a machine learning wizard, one of those magical people, I would love to work with you. Otherwise, I have to become one myself. Yes?
Really quick question. If the land can never be developed, why would somebody buy it?
Oh, because you can use it for what there is there. So this property, let's have a closer look. Well, for example, what you see here is agricultural use, right? Then there's a bridge here. Oh, you actually don't necessarily see it, but this is an agricultural field. I think I put this this bighorn sheep right on top of the house that is there. So that might be a little bit of a biased view, but you can use the property as a recreational ranch, but you cannot, let's say, subdivide it and make a big complex out of it. Question?
Is the placement estimate an estimate of the sales price, like the next sales price, or is it the appraisal, like you're appraising it and that's what the place is estimate?
That's a good question. So of course you can think about those, like the way to get towards the right appraised value in several ways. You can either model what the appraiser does, which is you take the sample, you try through matching, identify the most comparable properties, you do some adjustment, and then you come up with a value, which is not what I did here. Or you can just throw the entire sample in there, in this case a random forest algorithm, and then predict the value for that particular property given that algorithm.
So if they're biased towards being sold above the appraised value, the random forest would have a higher estimate than the appraisal.
Can you repeat that?
So like if it's being trained, am I not speaking loud enough?
What's that? No, can you just?
Oh, if the appraisal values tend to be under the next sale value, won't the places estimate then also be higher than the appraisal values?
I'm not entirely sure whether I understand the question. So just to clarify, this one here is essentially a prediction of the sales price. So if we have 250, in this case, 250 properties, all of which sold. And the sale price of those sales is predicted through the random forest algorithm.
Oh, so I guess then my
And
follow-up
so we're
is,
predicting the sale price for this property under the condition that it was protected. with the
yeah,
easement.
so I guess my question is, are you trying to get a sense of what the better appraisal value is through this?
Yes, essentially yes. Yeah, we're trying to get at, well, what we're actually trying to get at is the difference between those two. Right? So yes, it's interesting, of course, to know how much is this property worth with and without, but what we actually want to get to is the difference between those two. Here we only looked at what the appraised value of the sold land is with an easement. We have lots of questions. It's also almost the end of the time, but yeah. I'd take questions now. Yeah, why not? Yes.
So what do you do when the size of the parcel doesn't, oh, I'm sorry. What do you do technically when the size of the parcel that the tax assessor is actually keeping track of doesn't match your 1 hectare minimum?
Oh, what am I doing if the parcels are smaller?
Yeah.
No, good question. Well, I would say you would probably have some edge effects at the sample, you know, where like you get towards 1 hectare. Most of the properties are larger. The simple answer is I just reduce the minimum parcel size on my system, which is just one of the parameters set to exclude mostly urban parcels. Most things that are smaller than 1 hectare are just small urban parcels. I would expand that sample if I think that is a concern.
I have a particular reason
area.
for asking, which we can talk about offline.
Yeah. There were more questions. Yes.
Yeah, so when a property is sold publicly, don't all easements need to be made public?
Yes, easements are,
Yeah.
well, this is a good question. Not every landowner who buys a property knows that there's an easement on it. Usually they have to know. Like
Yeah,
if they
isn't
do
that
their
like
proper
real estate
research,
fraud?
But it has, I know that it has at least happened that landowners bought a property and they didn't know that there was an easement on it.
And so my question is, if those easements need to be known, isn't this like a hedonic pricing problem where it's just a big regression with what's the difference of the easement?
Exactly. Just
Yeah,
that
okay.
probably the functional form of that regression is completely unknown because we have a lot of parameters that have strongly nonlinear relationships and probably very locally specific relationships with sales value. But other than that, yes, that's exactly the approach. Yeah. Yes.
So at the very beginning, you said you can use ArcGIS because it doesn't work with a cluster. So have you tried it on your own machine or other Windows machine? Does it have the same topological error?
Oh yeah, no, ArcGIS does not have those typological errors. ArcGIS does this very nicely.
So
The problem is that I want to run this on 3,000 machines at the same time.
Yeah.
Because the polygon intersections take a lot of time. Polygon intersections are quite expensive computationally, actually. And so I need to run this county by county, and I cannot run this on my own machine. Nor like even 10 computers would not be enough to comfortably run those intersections. But
I have another one.
Another question?
Is that possible the parcels change shape? So like the landowner split the parcel to 2 and sell half of it? Or is that possible? Will it influence your algorithm?
yes, well, your first question was, is that possible? Yes, it is possible. Yes, it happens all the time. And yes, all the parcel layers usually only refer to one particular time period. You can probably use several years, but for now the system only takes it from 1 year, which creates problems. You have to check for that. You have to, for example, compare. If you find a good match, you have to make sure the reported area is the same. There are lots of small quality controls built into that system to make sure that we have a good match. But it is a problem, and those parcel layers have to be updated regularly. Which is why it is good to have a system where you just throw in a new parcel layer and it generates all the data for you. Yeah, that's a question there. In the back.
I have a quick question. Very interesting talk. Nevertheless, did you run your model here actually also for the parcel without the system, without the rebate on that entire story?
I did not do that
and
yet.
don't you have the same money distance between
it might be. You might
it's
exactly.
a market value which is fluctuating all the
No,
time?
that's exactly right. You might have that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No, this is ongoing work. If I wasn't teaching that much, I would already have done that. That's the short answer. Yeah. Yes.
Earlier, you had a map of the counties or regions of the United States where you had the full parcel and sales information, and there's a north-south line like through West Texas where there's just no information available. Is there any what's the reason for that?
I would have to speculate. I would have to speculate. Well, my general assumption is that counties that have generally wealthier populations and more people will have a higher ability to invest in a good information system at the county level, and will also have a higher need if there are more transactions, and general higher need for transparency. But I would really have to speculate. Yes, you definitely see that you have this line here where you're missing data, and all of these are of course the plains. I'm not entirely sure, other than that I assume that there was not the aggregators who are both the county offices and the aggregators aggregating the county offices' data have a higher incentive to focus on those locations which have expensive land and which have a lot of transactions, and that's why you see less development in central Kansas. Or yeah.
Don't bother rerunning; they're all underwater now. Anyway.
Other questions?
Something like the Conservation Reserve Program fit into this. I mean, for those people who sign up, are signing up to 10 years, for example, of not farming land that they've traditionally farmed. Have you tried to? I mean, all these places that don't have data, that's where the Conservation Reserve Program is quite important.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Conservation Reserve Program, for those who are not familiar with it, is essentially a temporary land right transaction. So where easements are permanent, conservation reserves are contracts made with the landowner. In most of the current literature, that's referred to as payments for environmental services. And yes, most of those happened in exactly the area for which we do not have data here. Well, the first question is, how would it fit in there, data-wise, if we had information, of course, on where those conservation reserve investments took place? We would be able to include that. From the few conversations I had with people that have worked on this program, that information is actually not accessible. So as far as I know, you don't have parcel information about which exact place was protected when. You can have county level aggregates, or I think perhaps even finer than that. But I believe there were certain privacy restrictions related to that. Other than that, you would estimate the impact probably relatively similar. You would run, let's say, you would run into the same problems of inference, but you would also be able to use the same methods and the same data. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, but there's not a big difference between evaluating something like the Conservation Reserve Program or private land acquisitions. Another follow-up question, or?
Well, but how do you do this where, I mean, in New England you're doing it, you're measuring, forest losses and proxy.
Oh, okay, the impact. Well, whatever you can observe, and I think no one knows better what you can observe from space in this room than you and your colleagues in the remote sensing research groups. If you can't observe it, you can't measure. If you cannot observe it over large scales and consistently over longer time horizons, it's not. Well, you need to collect the outcome data on the ground, or you cannot do this. So yeah, that explains why most of my work is on deforestation, because it's the one easiest land cover change to observe. And development is also getting increasingly easy, but for many of the changes that you have, it's not easy to observe from space. You get a lot of error.
Let's take two more questions. So one in the back and the back.
Yes.
Yeah, you kind of briefly mentioned some of the challenges that you went through, but could you talk through
just sort of, or skim over, I guess, your process for how long it took to navigate these systems. You said at one point like 2 years. So, so was it, you know, could you just break down, even if it's 3 months here, 6 months there, and then how much the team was? Because I'm trying to get, I have a similar project, and I'm trying to get an idea of like how much sort of human power is necessary, or what's the balance of human power and computing power. But when you're navigating these systems that, you know, like you said, some of them are written with different nomenclature, et cetera. So like how, could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I would say, so until, okay, first, of course, all of this builds on an enormous amount of human work. Any of those data sets were large teams of people that have worked on them. Bringing them together was, until very recently, a one-man exercise. So I didn't have a team. I just did that myself, essentially. With the exception of coding appraisals and easements, which didn't need a lot of manpower. And as I mentioned more recently, I was happy to have help with connecting the parcels to the tax assessor information. But other than that, so far this was mostly my own work, and it's hard to really trace exactly how the path went, but it took essentially all the time that I wasn't teaching or advising, which was, yeah.
I'll try to go quick. So the focus of what you're looking at is essentially restrictions on parcels where land use has been restricted in some way, shape, or form. I'm wondering about the complement. For example, most of the country is not under some kind of a land use restriction, right? But you've got a really rich database with a lot of information. And I'm thinking about things like agriculture and rangelands. Can you think about ways that you might use the database that you've built to try and inform how land managers might manage farmland, manage rangemen more effectively? It just seems to me like there's this whole other complement to the hectarage, to use your term, that might be sort of, I don't know, really interesting and useful to look at.
Yeah, so in terms of other applications of this data set, I actually believe there are quite a few. I've talked with all kinds of groups that are interested in working with this, and I haven't even started advertising this in the general, many of the academic communities. Let me actually answer this question with my very last slide, which is the same one as you saw before. If someone has a question, I would be very happy to make sure this data set suits the purposes for that. If there's one variable missing at this point, it is really not a big effort to add another data set into the system. Most of the things are in place and working really smoothly right now. All right, so this was a lot of work for a specific set of questions that I would like to ask. For those who would like to ask different questions or collaborate on answering those questions, I'm a very happy collaborator. Yeah.
Well, first let's thank Christoph for an amazing talk. I think this is, I can say without a doubt, in the last, 3-4 years I've been doing this, this is one of the best presentation by junior faculty fellows, just judging by the amount of questions and interest. And so thank you very much. This is amazing. As a matter of fact, we'd like to end with a little gift that I'm going to give to Christoph. He cannot tell what it is, so I'll tell him what it is. It's something that, if you go to the website of the Institute, we're very proud of how we think about computing and data. We think of it as a magnifying glass, that through which you see a very different picture than if you didn't have the data. And I think today you get to see when what he's presenting is just a different perspective about how to look at the problem, which all of a sudden you can ask all sorts of questions, just like you get a magnifying glass and you look at your problem through the data lens or through the computational lens. So we always give our junior faculty fellows and sort of people that we really care for this little gift, which is a magnifying glass. It has the name of the institute in it. You probably will not use it, you're still young, but when you get a little older, perhaps you can, it will become in handy. And I just really want to thank you for a wonderful talk. And, you know, one thing that I say about Junior Faculty Fellows, we like to sort of bring you in so that you're an insider, and then we can sort of help you with the research. You didn't even wait for more than a year to leverage that, and we're looking forward to a lot more work with you. So congratulations, and thank you all.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much for coming. If you're not American, as I am, one thing that this data set does really well is help you to get to know the country.
That's a good question to ask.
So that's something that you,
Why should I go
magnifying glass on the country. Yeah.
Good stuff.